I want to talk to you about this word, glonacal. It's a strange word, it's a made-up word, and it's a word that captures some key ideas about the context in which we teach and learn English in the modern world. And these key ideas, I think, have a lot of impact on what we do as teachers and how our students react and interact with the content that we teach. So what does this word glonacal mean? Well, it has three parts to it. Global. That has to do, obviously, with the way in which the work we do as teachers of English sits in the international, global environment. The second part of it has to do with national. Because although the national environment is part of the global environment, it's also distinct from it. And it defines the kind of things that go on in our classrooms at a national level. So often our curricula are shaped by national concerns. The tests that our students take are shaped by national concerns. And in fact, the goals of the education we offer are usually defined nationally. All of that, though, is supposed to relate to a global set of concerns. But then there's a third piece to this puzzle, which is this part, or the local. So when we talk about teaching and learning English in a glonacal world, we're talking about three levels of impact that shape the teaching and learning of English. The global, international, transnational level. The national, which, as I said, defines often the curriculum, the tests, and the goals of our education system. And the local conditions under which the national is delivered. So in many countries, the local environment has a lot more to do with what our students learn than the national environment or the global. However, because our students live in a global world and in a national world and a local world, those three levels are always interfacing and interacting with what they learn and what we teach. Here's a picture of the classroom. Now, representing the classroom as a triangle is something that many people have done, beginning with David Hawkins back in the 1960s and going up through the work of colleagues at the University of Michigan, Deborah Ball and her colleagues, in looking at what they called the instructional triangle, the work of the teacher, the work of students, and content, and how those three pieces constantly are interacting in the teaching and learning in the classroom. So what does this view of the classroom have to do with the glonacal world? Well, if we put the glonacal world around the outside here, we recognize that it has an impact on the teacher. Who the teacher is and what the teacher knows about the global, the national, and the local has a lot to do with the way in which he or she interacts with students. If the teacher is, for example, someone from a country where English is spoken, a so-called native speaker, that teacher brings one set of understandings to the students, whereas if the teacher is someone who is from a national culture where English may not be the dominant language, he or she brings another set of understandings. So the way in which the teacher interacts with the global, the national, and the local shapes things for students. Secondly, the way in which the students interact with the glonacal world is equally important in the classroom. What does that mean? Well, think about students who are on their telephones, on the internet, using the web. The way in which the world comes into student learning now is very different at the global level than it was before. When I started out teaching as a high school teacher, teaching French, I knew that my students really only had access to French through what I did in the classroom, and possibly if they saw some French on television, or maybe if they went to a movie, which wasn't very common to go to a movie in French. Now, when I think about students in classrooms, they have access to the language and the culture all the time if they get access to the internet and to the global world that that represents. So the glonacal world shapes the way in which students experience the classroom very differently than it did 20, 30 years ago. And finally, the glonacal world defines the content differently, because the notion of a standard, a fixed view of what the content is constantly being interrupted and assaulted, and in some ways reshaped by the fact that the world around it is so much more related to the content than it ever was before. So the way that the global enters into the classroom, as we said, through technology, the way in which the national shapes the curriculum, the way in which the local shape the resources that teachers have, all of these things together, the glonacal forces shape what students do with each other, the way the teacher works with them, and the way in which the teacher works with the content and the students. So we talked about the glonacal world, global, national, and local, and how it impacts on the teacher, the students, and the content. And I want to look particularly at how language works in this picture, and how classrooms work to both contain and limit and also express language as students learn it and teachers teach it in the glonacal world. So imagine this as a classroom, and imagine this as the content. One of the things that the classroom does is to contain and to hold and to limit that content. So while the content exists in the world, when it gets into the classroom, it becomes focused and it becomes limited, and that allows students to get a hold of it, to practice it, to work with it, to use it, and ultimately to feel some level of control and mastery over it. That's one thing the classroom does. But in the glonacal world, one of the problems is that the content is constantly going back into the world. It's mixing back with what exists out in the world, and it needs to have its relevance reinforced by what's going on in the world. So if the language that we teach in the classroom bears no real connection to the language that our students are experiencing through their interactions in the world, then we're creating a level of artificiality which defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. On the other hand, if the language which students experience in the world is being captured in the classroom, then the classroom is reinforcing its relationship to the larger glonacal world. So what do we do? How do we make that connection work? Well, I think we make it work in a couple of ways. The first is that we focus on the fact that what students are doing in the classroom is using language. They're using language to do things in the same way that they use language to do things in the larger external world. So the definition of what language learning in the classroom is needs to shift away from mastery and control to use. And the way in which students use language is defined by what they want to do with the language in the wider world. The second thing is that the way in which the classroom contains language has to reflect the way in which that language works in the larger world. So to say that something is correct is not an absolute statement. What we're saying is something is correct in the context of the classroom, and it may be correct in the context of the world, or it may not. And the proof of the connection of what goes on in the classroom and what goes on in the world is the way in which the content can move from one to the other and back and forth. This is true of language. It's not true of other contents in school, but it's definitely true of language. And the third connection is that students need to be the ones that are doing the movement of the content from the world to the classroom and back. In other words, students need to be the ones that are selecting from the global and the national world to make it local in their classroom. Because when students make that selection, they are in fact defining the way in which they want the content to work for them. So teaching that allows students to be in control of what they're trying to learn is bound to be more effective in this kind of a world than teaching that is dominated by what the national or standards say about what ought to be happening. So the glonacal world changes the role of teaching and learning because of the way in which content moves back and forth between the classroom and the world. Now this connection is permeable, it's flexible, and it's constantly changing, which makes the job of the teacher and the role of the student equally flexible, permeable, and changeable. And that's part of what makes language learning and language teaching so interesting.